So where were we? The aftermath of the embargo in 1807, which was Jefferson's attempt at what he called peaceful coercion. Uh, I've said it before, but just a reminder that the idea that the United States overestimates the value of its commerce to the rest of the world, so much so that two presidents tried to use not trading with the belligerents in the Napoleonic Wars to try to get them to change their policy. And it didn't work. People suffered around the world, but it was Americans, it was probably French colonists and their slaves on the islands in the Caribbean. And it was certainly parts or elements of the English commerce economy. But again, not as much where the English would say, oh no, no trade with the United States. The trade with the United States was part of their economy. And that certainly would affect them, but the idea of us not trading with Great Britain and them in some ways saying, all right, that's unsatisfactory to us. Whatever demands you have the United States, we will accede to them. That really wasn't going to happen. So I left off last time with the idea that the embargo stops exports, but also greatly slows imports. We're going to see this in the aftermath. It is an unforeseen development of the embargo that America seems to have like a light bulb moment where we say, all right, we don't have and are technically not allowed to export items. No ship captain would come into the United States with European goods from around the world, then unload their cargo and then be unable to leave with anything produced in the United States. You'd have to literally fill your ship with, sandbags just for ballast so that it would stay even in the water. So that slows down imports as well. And I think during the time of the embargo, all the way to the end of the war, it's one of those light bulb moments for the United States where the country thinks, wait, if we relied so much, we don't realize we rely so much on European products. What if, and then, cue the light bulb above people's heads, ding, what if we made these products here in the United States? And if we do, in the aftermath of the war, it's going to be nice if the government of the United States would step in and protect the American infant industry. So the birth of American manufacturing, I think, happens in 1805 and definitely accelerates with the embargo in 1807, or as the people in New England called it, oh, grab me. They spelled embargo backwards. And they like to say, wow, here's Thomas Jefferson, the benighted philosopher who, when he was in Washington's cabinet, absolutely, had to leave in 1793 because he didn't like the policies of Washington and Hamilton. They were too pro-British. They were too elastic interpretation of the Constitution as far as he was concerned. But in short order, Jefferson has to use Federalist or Hamiltonian means to get enforcement of the embargo. And yeah, it's borderline treasonous what the New England states do after 1807, and especially as we're going to find out during the war itself. They stop or try to impede recruitment efforts of the Army. They withhold taxes, and they thwart the American war efforts in their backyard along the border between New England and New York. And that's going to basically prevent an American invasion into Canada, which everyone thinks is going to be a really easy thing to happen. New England, of course, argues, and the New England Federalists, a party that had basically been confined to the ash heap of history after 1800, has something of a revival in 1807 and 1808. They call for civil disobedience and resistance to the embargo. They petition the President of the United States. They tell President Jefferson that the embargo is crushing their trade, which is true. Massachusetts loses $15 million in freight revenue during 1808. Their exports are down 80%, 80%. That's a shocking blow to the economy. Southern planters in the Mississippi Territory and Orleans are hurting, but they abide by it. They're Jeffersonian, and they say, all right, this is not maybe the greatest for us, but we'll back our president. In January of 1809, on the very end of his presidency, Jefferson gets Congress to pass what's called the Enforcement Act, the 1809 Enforcement Act, to punish violators and put in place new search and seizure rules that may have made the English blush during the 1760s. But remember, this is the president who says, literally, that counties in New York are literally in open rebellion in violation of the embargo. So he has to put this in place. Meanwhile, he has to hand this policy over to his successor, James Madison, who wins a close election in 1808, the heir apparent of Thomas Jefferson and the second in line for what will be known as the Virginia dynasty.
Who does he run against? Who is like?
Why? You did a stump the chump question already? No. I know he runs against DeWitt Clinton, I believe, in 1812. In 1808, I do not know. No, it's fine. I will tell you when I do not know.
Because it's.
I don't know who they ran against in 1808.
Pinckney.
Was it Thomas or Charles?
Charles.
Charles Cotesworth Pinckney or Charles Pinckney?
Charles Cotesworth.
Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina. Often get the Pinckneys confused. Yes, Vice President Thomas under John Adams. Yes, and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney may have actually been the candidate again in 1816, really the last time the Federalists ran a candidate. So we hear about, with relation to the embargo, the principle of what? Secession, nullification, but secession movements in the United States prior to really the 1830s are centered in New England. Connecticut starts to use some ideas that, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had come up with in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The idea of interposition. You have a federal law, you have the people, the state then interposes itself, inserts itself between the state and the people to protect them from what they consider to be an unconstitutional law. The Embargo Act, meanwhile, was repealed in 1809, the last day Jefferson was in office. That's when he's going to leave and retire. Madison's going to come in. Presidents were inaugurated in March. President Madison takes office, replaces the Embargo Act with the Non-Intercourse Act, which essentially says we will not trade with only England and France. Again, they're manipulating the system now. Why shut down all of trade? Now they're just going to target and focus on the two warring powers. The other issue that Madison must deal with during his presidency early on, not only a split in his party, a party that's divided, that wants to go to war, that wants to seek some kind of peaceful means. You've got the old school Republicans who argue for, even more than Jefferson, they're purist in a limited government. They don't like the idea of going to war. They're called the old Republicans, people like Thomas Randolph of Virginia. And when Madison gets into office, the party is split. And he also is dealing with an Indian Confederacy that we'll talk about. Again, maybe one of the most successful, if not the most successful, Indian leader during this time. And that's the Tecumseh movement, along with his brother, Tenskwatawa. Sorry, go ahead.
Patrick Henry, is he Republican?
He was. I don't believe he was involved in politics, though, at that point. He may not even been alive. I think he died at the end of the 1700s. I have to double check that, but yeah. Okay, there we go. This is the map I wanted to show you. Indians in the Northwest have been angered ever since the Treaty of Grenville, which happens after the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So now we're going back 1794, 1795. This section here is what is now Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, the American Northwest. His brother is the spiritual leader of this pan-Indian movement. He's called by whites the prophet, but his Indian name is Tenskwatawa. What they tried to do beginning in 1805, 1806 is organize, as we called it effectively, a confederation of Indians of different nations. And their goal was to stop what Tecumseh, who's the warrior end, Tenskwatawa, who is the revivalist, their brothers. What they try to do is stop the practice of what the United States had successfully done to gain more territory. It's the divide and conquer strategy. It's the idea that you negotiate with individual Indian leaders, and little by little, you're being pushed further west and turning over by treaty and by conflict more land.
So they wanted to form like a Northwest version of the Six Nations, or which nations? Like,
Well, they wanted, right, yeah, in some ways, but they all,
but you know what I'm trying to.
not necessarily politically, but what they were trying to do is say, look, when you negotiate to give away land, all of the Indians involved in that area must be consulted and must approve. The other part that was worrying to the government, to Washington, the War Department, and Madison, is that he is trying to bring this to the other powerful confederacy in the Southwest, which is like the Iroquois in the Northwest, in the Northeast of New York. Those are, of course, the Creeks. The Creek Confederation that, going back to Washington, tried to deal with. I mean, they were a force that Washington thought, we can't literally go to war with them. They're stronger than us. So we try to negotiate with treaty. And the treaty, when it failed, the Treaty of New York in 1790, it pushed McGillivray and the Creeks closer towards the Spanish in Florida and in Louisiana as well. So Tecumseh is the individual who travels to the different areas of the Northwest. And so he's Shawnee. He's Shawnee Indian, as is his brother, Tenskwatawa. But you're dealing with all of this region. The headquarters of Tecumseh's confederation is here, Prophetstown. It's the connection of the Tippecanoe and the Wabash River that you can see there on the map. So he travels to the Northwest Indians. He makes literally what we would call recruitment efforts into the Creek Indians. And he gets from them, this is important at the start of this conflict, because we call the War of 1812 a war within a war. You know, it's the war within the Napoleonic Wars. But the war within the war within the war is the United States against Tecumseh's Confederation and the Creek War of 1813 and 1814, which is very important for the aftermath of this conflict and the United States. I mean, when you think about the amount of territory that opens up in the aftermath of the war, and the fact that Tecumseh's Confederation, once broken, is maybe the only thing that could have stopped or slowed or impeded the progress of Americans pouring into this region. I mean, how quickly did they become states? All in the 18 teens after the war. Think about what this means when you connect it to the Southwest. How quickly do they become states as well? The 18 teens. You got Louisiana, obviously, but that's settled prior to the purchase. And then, of course, you have the Mississippi and the Alabama territory. And we have this practice of adding north-south states until we get to Missouri. Yeah, 22 states, 11 free, 11 slave, and then Missouri. What in the world are we going to do with Missouri? But that's a story we'll get to after the war. The first territory to be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, not including Louisiana.
Yeah, something that you just pointed out, like most of the wars, the Indian wars, have been covered up by other major events in history.
Sure.
While like with this war, you only hear about like a footnote of it because you want to learn about the war.
Right. I mean, you read about the French and Indian War, and you think the French and Indian War, so Indians were involved, but the early histories of the French and Indian War, people like Francis Parkman who wrote about it. Now, this guy would write 2 pages in his history about a tree. I mean, he's very descriptive, and the language is just of the time period, more romantic style of writing. But for a conflict called the French and Indian War, you don't know a lot about the motivations of the Indians.
The French and the Indians until someone, because it's the name of the war.
Well, they are what the narrative from their perspective is what's done to them and not what they can do, which is control events. I think that's where the history has changed, the perspective has changed, and made it a much richer story. Absolutely. And to understand that this within, especially the Creek War, is a divide between Indian cultures. Jackson fights with Cherokee Indians on his side, not fight alongside, because they figure it's probably better to ally with the American militia in Tennessee and Georgia and against the Creeks, which is truly ironic when Jackson is president, is the chief mover of the Indians, who the 5 civilized nations, including the Creek. So again, a guy of deep, deep prejudices against the British. We'll find out how that plays out, but also Native Americans, as from a perspective that we could maybe not understand and we would scoff at, but we have to take into account this notion from Jackson that if they stay where they are, they're all going to die. And he blames, meaning if you try to remain in your ancestral land east of the Mississippi River, your survival is not going to happen. Whites are guilty of moving in, taking land away, and making their land that traditionally was theirs smaller and smaller until there's nothing left there. So the best solution is to up and move. Now, he doesn't, of course, take into account that Indians in New York State have been there for a long time, and while their amount of land that they control was much smaller, he was thinking and looking at the Indians in New England, who are just, I mean, find Indians in New England. They're gone. They're gone. I mean, you know, that goes back to colonial times when the Pequot were basically, wiped out. There wasn't even a Pequot nation after the 1630s. So, I mean, I was telling you all about, just to get off track a little bit, but, you know, this group of junior high kids that come and we role play, and before all the pandemic, we did the Cherokee Treaty. And it's not just a question of sign the treaty, move west, bad, stay and fight the United States, good. I mean, so I gave everybody a role. I said, you're with the treaty faction and you're with the Cherokee want to stay. And they all had to come up and make arguments. So it's not just a question of, you know, you're selling out your fellow Indians if you agree that you're going to move, take the payments of the United States government, and go to what's now the Oklahoma Territory. Because there's a strong argument to say we can maintain our independence and we will survive if we up and leave. And others are saying no. Now, the United States has consistently changed its policies on treaties and not honored them, and we should stay, remain, fight. So it's not just a simple, clear-cut black and white divide between the sides here. And so and I think they understood that more. Again, someone even got to play Andrew Jackson. You know, he would make speeches in front of everybody else, and they are representatives of the government. So again, that just gets to the whole idea of the more nuanced story from the Native American perspective. That 60 years ago, you wouldn't have heard as much in a college class. It's like, oh, the Indians, you know, lost and they moved and they fought, but the why, or what they were trying to do, or in the case of Tecumseh, they were just puppets controlled by the British out of Canada. You know, they didn't credit historians their own, what we would call, agency. What were their motivating factors? Well, it has nothing to do with the English until the Americans drive them towards the English. That's what Harrison and the Madison administration essentially do. So what is this Indian revival? What does it mean? For Tenskwatawa, it means throwing out the adoption of living like the whites, or their clothing, which they get rid of. Modern American textile clothing. I mean, these are not temporary, I mean, again, popular images of Native Americans. These are semi-permanent villages here around Prophetstown and on those rivers where they survive there. So they throw out their European-style clothing, even adopt their old weapons. Sometimes they keep modern guns. They say they shouldn't drink. Tenskwatawa says he was, again, a former alcoholic, reformed alcoholic. He actually shot one of his eyes out when he was either an arrow or with a gun. He just, had an accident with it. And that's the reason why he will later say, as a spiritual leader, that he is impervious to bullets. So it's an interesting Indian revival. It's what it really is. Throw out the modern things that you have done and live like your ancestors did. And if you are to give up land, you are to do it with the agreement of all the Indians who will be affected and involved.
Because
And so it's a very popular idea, whether the government comes in and they just chip away at the Indians' land in the Northwest. Indian raids continue on white settlements and begin to increase after 1810. And this is where it gets involved in not only the Madison administration, but this gentleman here. This gentleman here. This is William Henry Harrison, who is the territorial governor of the area. So that would encompass Illinois and Indiana. Yeah, this is not, again, when he was young. We know what William Henry Harrison does later on. Politician, later, what's that?
dies in 30 days.
Dies 30 days in office in 1841. Yeah, they nicknamed him old Granny Harrison. But here was a man full of vigor, as they would say in New England. And the book on him was called, recently came out, Jefferson's Hammer. And that's a reference to he was appointed, because these are territories and not states, by Jefferson. So he's a military man, military background, and fights in several conflicts, only to be retired to the presidency, where it's the shortest one to this day. Harrison assembles a force of about 1,000 soldiers. 250 of them are in the regular army. The rest are in militia, and they camp outside near Prophetstown. Harrison and Tecumseh meet regularly. They have respect for each other. Here's Harrison on Tecumseh. He's one of those uncommon geniuses who spring up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things. If it were not for the vicinity of the United States, he would perhaps be founder of an empire that would rival in glory that of Mexico or Peru. That's Harrison on Tecumseh.
That's actually a nice statement.
Yeah, there's respect there. And there is, of course, the promise from Tecumseh to Harrison that this movement is peaceful, which Harrison says, yes, but Indians that are in this area are attacking settlements. There's back and forth violence, as there always is in this section. But it's Tecumseh who tells his brother, the prophet, I am heading south again to try to increase the numbers who pledge loyalty to this idea of this Indian Confederation that will really succeed if it's in the Northwest and the American Southwest. By that we mean mostly Creek country in Georgia and most of Alabama at this point. We're going to talk about the Creek War in detail, and you'll see the Creek villages in north central Alabama, and it's an overwhelming strength that they have there. So he tells his brother, Tenskwatawa, the prophet, Harrison is really encamped near Prophetstown. Whatever you do, don't provoke an attack against Harrison's soldiers. And he leaves.
You don't tell someone to not do it, because then they're just going to do it.
And that's exactly what he did. The prophet foolishly attacked Harrison's larger force, which was caught off guard at first until they brought more soldiers and force to bear and routed those Indians under Tenskwatawa, or the prophet's control, burned Prophetstown. You can almost imagine Tecumseh coming back and seeing the ruined remains of the prophet's town. This happens in November of 1811. So this is even before the conflict between the United States and Great Britain begins. Your question?
Why did the prophet, why did
Tenskwatawa, yeah.
Why did he attack them? So did he think...
Thought he had an advantage. Thought the soldiers there were... Yeah, but he had those among him maybe who convinced him of it. Also the idea of assessing the American forces. If you're overwhelmingly, in this case, 3/4 of your force are militia, there's probably an expectation that you'll... And militia are skilled at doing one thing usually in the minds of the regular army and Indians, running when the battle starts, away from the battlefield. Typically, not always, but
I would do that.
Yeah. What's the line from the movie? If I run today, I can live to run another day. So, gosh, I forget what movie that comes from. It might be that Mel Gibson Western movie. Anyway, And again, he's always portrayed the film as a coward, but yeah, he's not really all that much. So that's part of what now the new president has to deal with in his administration. This happening independent of the continued deteriorating situation between the United States and Great Britain. The Non-Intercourse Act does not work. They end up repealing that and then opening up trade with both countries sometime in 1810. The other factor is going back to this notion of a divided party. In 1810, we see the election of 63 new members of Congress. That's a pretty big deal, considering there are, and you're going to ask how many are there total? 142. So almost half of Congress turns around in what we would today call the midterm elections, right? 2010 or 2022, 1810, it's the year between the presidential elections. Here are two of them. A gentleman on the left is John Calhoun, upstate South Carolina. His home is on the Clemson campus in northwestern South Carolina. Henry Clay, who is from Kentucky. Felix Grundy of Tennessee. They are called by the Federalists in Congress, and there are still Federalists in Congress, the war hawks, because they are hawkish, not doves who like peace, but hawks who favor conflict. They get elected to Congress, and I think the problem as far as, understanding politicians often, yeah, let's go to war. Me? No, I won't, but others will. There's that notion that, we'll vote for it, and some do. I mean, Henry Clay's sons will fight in the Mexico War, in the Civil War too.
But did they have a choice, or did he make them fight?
He was dead by then, but yeah, no, they probably went on their own. It depended, well, in the Civil War, unless they had slaves, they could actually get a way around it. You were exempt. So they say that the conflict with Great Britain and England, of course, controlling out of Canada, the political organization and revival movements by Tecumseh and his brother. All that is British control. That is incorrect, but that's the perception they have. And these war hawks also say that this continued treatment by Great Britain to the United States is an insult to national honor. The war hawks. Clay and Calhoun will represent two of three. Daniel Webster would be the other one from Massachusetts. These folks are giants in the Senate. They will cast a long shadow. Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. There's a book about them called The Great. Sorry?
No, that's Merriam. Never mind. I got confused.
No, Daniel Webster. Yeah. These gentlemen will be in Congress from 1810 or 12 up to really 1850 is their last kind of combined appearance on the national stage over the Compromise of 1850. So yeah, in various forms, Clay will run for president 17 times. Now it only seems like it, but it's like 5 or 6 times he runs and is almost president in 1844. Calhoun, early in his career, will be a strong nationalist and then do a complete 180 degrees and be a main defender of the South, states' rights, nullification. Yeah, all that upon his death in 1850 as well.
Who was he a vice president for? Was he vice president?
For both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Secretary of War, Secretary of State.
Oh.
Yeah, a lot of Clay will serve in the House and Senate, be Speaker of the House for a while, serve in the Senate. Secretary of State as well, which is kind of a springboard to the presidency.
Did they start the pay system like they do now? If you hold one of these offices, you still get paid for life? So did he get all those paychecks or whatever?
No, I think only the current one that he held. Okay. Yeah, and then the pension, I don't know when that went into effect. But Congress after, this is something we'll talk about after the war, but Congress changed their pay scale after the war. You know what happened after they decided to get a salary? Instead of getting paid per day, you wipe out about a third of the Congress in 1816. They decided to pay themselves a regular straight salary. And the people in the United States said, nah. And everyone who voted for it, a lot of them were thrown out. So we used to have massive turnover in Congress, massive turnover. Now, not as much, better or worse. So that's Madison's other issue. President from 1809, when he takes the oath of office, he knows for the most part he is inadequate as a president. No one's going to confuse him with George Washington. The real excitement of the Madison administration is Mrs. Madison, Dolly, who insists, because James Madison is probably 5'2" or 3", maybe 110 pounds wet, that when he enters the room, the man should be escorted with the music of "Hail to the Chief." He walks in, everyone's like, did he get here yet? And then when the band plays, because Mrs. Madison says, yes, here's the music, and he's like, oh, okay. Again, a president who didn't have a good reputation for some reason during the later part of the 1800s and early 20th century. And at the end of the war, he's popular. And then now he's kind of having something of a revival. He's not the father of the Constitution, as a lot of people like to give him credit for. He is father of the Bill of Rights. You have to give credit where credit is due. Madison wrote a draft of the Constitution, which eventually the committee take and make compromises. But one of the last, one book on him is called The Last Founder. He dies in the 1830s. So he had a long career. And he has to explain himself and Jefferson and what they did until, a decade beyond Jefferson passes in 1826. Unfortunately, Madison also has a pretty incompetent cabinet, which doesn't help him until he gets some decent people involved, including both Secretary of War and Secretary of State. Yeah, you can apparently serve as both jobs, James Monroe, who he'll appoint later on. But a lot of the cabinet, just forgettable, unmentionable individuals. So he's got an incompetent cabinet, a divided party, and a Federalist resurgence. In many ways, some of the challenges that John Adams faced when he took in office. So it is Madison who gets the assurance from the British, probably at the end of 1811, beginning of 1812, that they are not going to change their policy toward the United States. They're going to still impress American sailors. They are still going to inspect American cargoes and seize it. This is a battle to the very end between France under Napoleon and Great Britain. So he decides it's probably best at this point, when there isn't going to be a change in English policy, to begin building up the military defenses of the United States. And his own Congress doesn't do it. They make very little preparations to go to war. And in June of 1812, he asks for the declaration of war. The War of 1812 is one of the strangest in American history. France and England had been fighting off and on since 1793, when the United States fights its old parent country. The casualties for the United States, relatively light, 6,765 battle deaths. Folks, more people die in a Napoleonic battle than all of the War of 1812 with the American casualties.
Does that include the Battle of New Orleans, since that happened after?
Yes, where the Americans took, I believe, 20 casualties, as opposed to the British 2,000 or so. We declare war and then tell the world that it is over impressment and neutral rights. That's what Madison mentions in June of 1812 when he declares war, or asks Congress for a declaration of war. Can these be justifications? Well, probably not, but we are woefully unprepared for war. Maybe that's a good part of our history. We usually are. We're not ready to go to war. When we entered World War I 100 years later, we have something like the 16th largest army in the world in 1917. World War II, we were an isolationist country that we're watching events play out and not really being a part of it. So what does Madison say? Well, he says, look, certainly there are events in the Northwest that we should be conscious of, and the British are, again, steering the Indian policies there. The English are impressing American sailors. This is the three themes of the war message. And English policies, this is where he talks about neutral rights. We always knew about the causes of the war, neutral rights. But Madison's argument before Congress is the English policy is not simply trying to defeat France, but they're trying to hurt us. They're really looking to take it to us. So neutral, the causes of the war itself. I mean, ask people to name someone connected to the war or anything about the war. Usually people come up with, 1812 is, somehow tied to it, the year. But beyond that, not a lot.
What are the three things again that you said?
Sure. The Indian events in the Northwest, the impressment of American sailors. Now, basically, he calls it kidnapping, which effectively it is without the ransom. They just take them and keep them. And third, neutral rights. Now, there's something worse that the English are doing than just trying to knock the French out of the war. They're literally trying to hurt us and economically cripple the United States. At the time when the war was over, they called it the Second War of Independence. It gave the country, and the war ends, not to give anything away here, but in a draw. Status quo ante bellum. What does the treaty that ends the war do? Ends the war. Anything else? No. Want payments back and forth? Nope. Territory changing hands? Nope.
They didn't have any territory to give away except for Canada, and they weren't.
Well, they tried. They tried. We tried to leverage Canada. They tried to leverage the American Northwest and later on New Orleans and the Gulf South. And it didn't happen. The United States Army in 1812 has 7,000 soldiers scattered around western forts. We have 16 naval vessels. England, to give you a comparison, has an army of 250,000 soldiers and 600 ships, probably 200 frontline battleships. We have 8. And we still think, and Jefferson says this from the comfort of his mountaintop in Monticello, the invasion of Canada will simply be done by marching. Just cross the borders between the United States and Canada, and we will be able to invade. And that's what the Warhawks' call had been. And members of Madison's own party say, I'm getting tired of listening to these Warhawks say, Canada, Canada, Canada.
That's the only way to get England out.
That's their strategy, absolutely.
So why wouldn't they think Canada? If you want to keep England and France from having territory here.
Because the realities beyond the myths are a lot different. Exactly. It's going to be easy. Look, we in the United States may forget about the War of 18. I mean, when the bicentennial happened in 2012, everyone was like, there's going to be a resurge of interest in it, just like the Civil War and the Ken Burns thing in the 90s. And a couple books came out. And no one really, the Canadians, meanwhile, this is a big deal in their history. I mean, they defended their territory from the aggressive United States. I mean, historians to this day say, well, the first American war of invasion, of aggression was the Mexico War. And I'm like, well, did anyone forget Canada? And yeah, it failed miserably, but we did have soldiers there that fought not well and not often. But okay, that's maybe just splitting hairs. No one wants a war. The British literally, around the same time that Madison is asking Congress for war, send a message to the United States government that we're going to drop the whole issue of impressments. Whoopsie, too late. If only we could have had communication faster than someone getting on a ship and having a message go across. You can't, news travels no faster than someone carrying said message. You can't do smoke signals from across the continent. Carrier pigeons can't fly that far. That's it. That's all you got. There's no telegraph, no interwebs, no phone, nothing. So the minute the war starts, both sides try to end it. Yet they fought for 3 years, essentially. Half of 1812, 1813, and 1814. The vote in Congress is divided. It is the most contentious vote for a war declaration in American history. 79-49 in the House, 19-13 in the Senate. A bare majority in the U.S. Senate. It's a puzzling vote, really, when you think about it. Let's break down the vote because historians for 200 years have been doing that. The South and West support it. New England opposes it. And you would think it would be opposite. New England, who is basically killed by the economy's killed, would want to go to war and end British practices that had shut down their economy, or more importantly, forced Jefferson and Madison to try to leverage the American economy to get the French and English to change their policies. And you think the South and West may have opposed it.
I think it's the opposite.
You think it's right?
That the North was afraid that if they declared war, then the English and Canada would invade them, like
True,
England. So, I
true.
mean,
And
they
it's,
could
and
look
it's,
out for stuff
it's
like
begged the
that.
question for 2 centuries. Why did New England oppose it? It leads many to wonder about any kind of secret alliances or other motives that were taking place. Let's consider a couple. New England sympathized with England
Yeah.
in the Napoleonic Wars. So there's that.
They're
I mean,
still
even to the
fighting.
point where your commerce is destroyed by the English, maybe. England, remember, Hamilton's idea. England is stable, France, various governments, and now this Corsican butcher. That's what they call Napoleon. They resent a lot of the Federalists in New England, the Republican sympathy for France. So we favor England, and we're willing to tolerate. I mean, the British dropped anti-war leaflets throughout New England with their ships. It's kind of like what we would do in World War II. We dropped them into Japan and to Germany to try to get the people to rise up against their government, but we dropped them by plane. Here, they park the anti-war material. It's the only part of the American coastline that the English do not launch a blockade against New England. They try to blockade the whole rest of the country because they knew war was not popular there. Maybe also, there's another theory, the New England states say an invasion of Canada, which is successful. Oh, God help us if it's successful, they think, will create future states that no doubt will fall into the Republican camp, further weakening the Federalist Party in the Northeast. So we'll just throw those out as possible motivations for why.
It is kind of true, though.
Why not? Decent reason. And of course, maybe the idea that war will make the economy, which is suffering, even worse. You know, there's an expectation with 200 warships, 600 total. The English can park their Royal Navy off the coast of the United States and completely shut down trade. And also knowing that maybe their states would be an invasion point. You know, the British are going to try to attempt to once again come down between New York and New England, just like they tried during the French and Indian War, just like the French had tried doing, during the American Revolution, where the British Army tried to do it, just like the French had tried invasion points in the 1600s as well. So this is really, we might say, a party issue when it comes down to the divide. The Republicans support it, the Federalists oppose it. If it is a Republican war, the stakes are very high, and some are saying the survival of the nation, nothing short of that, is at risk. Others think, look, the trade war had been going on since 1805, 1806, and this is a real war that's finally declared, is the inevitable consequence. But there are other factors for going to war. The term war or submission has been thrown out a lot by people who lived back then. We exhausted every means at our disposal, and the British wouldn't change. Again, echoing Madison's idea that the English are not there just to, their policies, knock out France, but to really hurt the economy of their former colonies. There's another reason to go to war. You know, the purgative efforts. It would refresh the national character of the United States. A regenerative act is war. Greed and the love of making money would go away in the aftermath. Okay, maybe. But war is destructive too. Maybe it would destroy the parties and bring the nation together. There would be one party government. There would be no distinctions, north, south, east, west, Republican, Federalist. Wishful thinking on maybe some of these reasons to go to war. But you've got to hand it to the Republican Party. They wage a war without the evils of war that might arise. This is a Republican conflict. You need to put in place Hamiltonian means when you go to war. But to Madison's infinite credit, he rarely does. This is why you have more towns named after Madison than probably any other president. In the immediate aftermath of the war, people were like, hey, we won, we fought a draw. But we get to choose what we remember in our collective memory.
But if we go
But winning the last battle was big, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So you forget about all the horrible things that I'm about to detail that happened in 1812 and 1813 and 1814 because Jackson and New Orleans.
Yeah, and that's the only thing they teach you in like junior high school.
Sure.
Is the Battle of New Orleans.
Sure. Wars are complicated. The issues by which we go to war are sometimes confusing. And you know, understanding why we would invade Canada, what that was going to gain for us, maybe aren't explained all the time. That's why I like to spend, whether it's 2010, I spent one class on it. This will spend probably two on it. You need to understand it. You need to understand that it's just not about the year 1812. There are other things working. You have debt, you have big military, you have high taxes. None of that really became parts and legacies of the war. There had been an effort in 1807, and this is the knee-jerk reaction after what? The Chesapeake incident, when the American warship was fired on and several American soldiers were killed, and adding insult to injury, the British captain of the Leopard could not find for the life of me why they named it that ship. All I do know, it was one of probably a dozen ships throughout British history that were named, going back to the 1500s, called christened the Leopard. It didn't seem to have anything to do with where it was made. It had been out there before. There's a historic connection and people who built this version that took on the Chesapeake knew about the glorious history of the name Leopard and said, let's go with it again. It's worked before. Anyway, so this idea of all of the typical things that you get with this conflict. And after 1807, when you had an effort to strengthen the military, which Jefferson is able to do, calls up the militia, begins to spend more money on coastal fortifications. The Republican Party by 1810 and 11 is saying, have we done too much? Are we going on a path too much towards favoring war? Should the armed forces, they begin to ask, I kid you not, 1810 and 11, on the eve of the war, should they be eliminated? We just no standing army. You have to understand the deep distrust that people in the United States had of a standing army.
I mean, it was sound. I mean, these are people that were able to remember the Watering Act, where they were forced to have British soldiers live in their house, and they couldn't do
standing armies are expensive. Yeah. They require taxes. And why in the world do you need one in time of peace? It's a good question. But in 1810 and 11, they decide that maybe using the militia would be a better solution. The Navy, meanwhile, is so small, just get rid of it. Jefferson loved to tout, he wanted the naval version of militia, the Mosquito Fleet.
What?
Yes, this is where you arm merchant ships. You smack some cannons onto a cargo ship and call it a naval vessel, given...
They're not made to do that.
It had worked during the Quasi-War. It had worked in other situations. It worked with the Barbary pirates harassing all European ships in the Mediterranean. So why not have this so-called mosquito fleet? I mean, it's an annoyance, it's pesky, but you get bitten by enough mosquitoes and, you know, you stay inside. You don't go out and confront the mosquito fleet. So bring it, Jefferson also, let's keep this in mind, it's not said enough, he's a pacifist. Yeah, he shivers the timbers of the Barbary pirates, but again, in his heart of hearts, he knows how warfare can be destructive to a young republic. Finally, in 1812, Congress votes, again, the year we're about to start the war with England, to add 25,000 soldiers to the 10,000 that they already had called up, augment it with militia, and build 12 ships of the line.
How many soldiers?
They wanted to. This is proposed in front of Congress. The army was, at the time, 10,000. They wanted to make it a standing army, 25,000, with a larger amount of militia. Build 12 ships of the line. Now, these are the biggest ships that you have. These are like battleships. And build 20 frigates. Congress votes this all down. So the proposal's there. We're dealing with the end of 1811 and the 1812 Congress. To pay for the war, you would have to institute taxes. Madison and the Republicans said, no, not unless the war commences. No new taxes. You have to borrow money as well, but the other factor at play in 1811 is that what goes away the year before the war? Hamilton's Bank. The BUS, the Bank of the U.S., has a 20-year charter, 1791. Add 20 years to that, it's 1811. The charter of the Bank of the U.S. expires, and Madison hadn't supported it in 1791, and he doesn't support it in 1811, the recharter. So you have...
He did or didn't?
Did not. Did not. He will after the war. He has an epiphany, apparently, where he thinks, yeah, it was awful hard to run a war without a bank. Because they had to borrow all the money from Americans, a lot of them being New England banks, which, yeah, they got wealthy supporting the war, lending money to the government. Congressmen also ignored the fact that right before the war started, Madison had ended their congressional recess. They left anyway. They just, you have to stay in session because we should vote on these measures. They're like, okay, sure, and they left, and they got back in time at least to vote for the declaration of war. The War Department of the United States was an impressive arm of the executive branch. They had a Secretary of War and 12 clerks, and they were reluctant to increase that at all. That's the War Department of the United States in 1812. So on June 18th, Madison signed a declaration of war, which was enthusiastically supported by many Republicans who for 6 months had voted against preparations for the war. There you have it. And then we can go invade Canada. That's the overall idea. The two leading field generals in the United States were 61 and 59 years old, and I put the old in old. As one historian of the conflict says, they were semi-senile heirlooms from the Revolutionary War. Ouch. Semi-senile heirlooms from the Revolutionary War, rusting on their laurels, not resting, but rusting on their laurels.
Yeah, they were trying to be nice and comparing them, which I think they were. That's really sad.
One was nicknamed by his own soldiers Granny. Ouch. 30 field grade officers in the United States Army, the colonels or majors, are old and incompetent. They're political appointees. They're Republicans, and that's your first primary qualification. Some, again, have wartime service. Hull, who's going to command, of course, in the Detroit sector of the Northwest, has that connection. The bright spot are some of the younger officers, people like Lieutenant Colonel Winfield Scott, who will first achieve glory in the War of 1812 and will last put on a uniform in the American Civil War 50 years later.
He's Confederate, right?
No. General of the Army, and expected to command against Confederate armies, except that in 1861 he can't get on a horse anymore and he has vertigo and says to Lincoln, no, I'm not going to be able to command, from anywhere from a desk. My choice, though. What was his choice? Lee.
Oh, so he was before Lee. I thought Lee was the first choice.
Lee was the first choice of Scott to lead the Union or Northern armies. And they have a meeting, and then that doesn't happen. And Scott's from Virginia too, but he's pro-Union. This is the first of 4 conflicts he's going to be involved in. Leads the invasion of Mexico City in 1847. One of the most decorated soldiers in American history. But at the time, again, just a junior officer who calls most of the old guys unfit. By the end of the first year of war, we had asked for 25,000 soldiers. After the declaration of war happens, we have 9,800. There are no shoes or uniforms. American cavalry units are impressive on paper, but they have no horses, which you need for cavalry. So there we go, everyone. That's the American state of affairs in 1812. Yet the United States in the summer of 1812 thinks we can invade Canada easily. Why? The number of people there are former loyalists. A lot of them are former Americans. They are not super connected to Great Britain. There are French people who hate the English and they will side with the United States. So we will march from American shores, across the international border into Canada, and literally raise up our own forces in Canada. That's the plan. It doesn't work at all. It doesn't work. Again, we may forget the war in the United States, but the Canadians celebrate the war because they repulsed the United States, and especially when they dealt with a lot of hardships, like some of their cities being burnt and taking casualties as well. The United States has a three-pronged invasion for Canada in 1812. I'll show you on the map. Let's get this slideshow. There we go. The first is along the Detroit region right here, the old French trading post of Fort Detroit in the Michigan Territory. That's number one. The second is near modern-day Niagara Falls, the Niagara River, and the border between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Where's the cursor go? And the third, the movement up the Hudson River, Lake Champlain, and capture Montreal. I mean, that would have been an absolute game changer. That had actually been successful. So there we go. The American forces on the move in 1812. Detroit offers the most promise, but disaster ensues during the summer of 1812. The American commander, General Hull, reaches the area near Detroit, occupies it with his soldiers. He is convinced that he is cut off and that an Indian attack is sure to follow. And the Indians in the area, along with the British commander, Brock, I think was his name, march essentially in a circle. It's an old trick to make your forces look a lot bigger. What was his name? George Rogers Clark did it during the American Revolution to the British, actually. And so Hull is looking there. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, look at all those Indians. And they're the same group passing again and again. The British commander promises the Americans there at Detroit, if I unleash the Indians on the fort, I'm not making any promises literally for what happens next, which means, you know, scalping and all kinds of horrible things. The wounded won't be safe. There'll be pillaging. And I think Hull apparently at this point sits in the corner, rocking in the fetal position, going and turns the fort over without a shot being fired, surrenders it. Fort Detroit, yeah, right here in the Michigan Territory. And to add insult to injury, the British decide they will annex the Michigan Territory to the domain of George III, which they do. So we're going to invade Canada, but the British have just added territorial elements of the United States to their overseas empire. In January of 1813, to try to stop the further invasion of the Northwest Territory, William Henry Harrison sends soldiers to protect Frenchtown, south of what's Fort Walden. Again, this is the area right here on the border between Ohio and Michigan. Wounded Americans who were left after the British attack near Fort Malden are then killed as they try to surrender. And this is a motivating factor for people in the Northwest. It happens along an area known as the Raisin River. So in the Texas War for Independence, we have Remember the Alamo. Remember the Raisin. I know, maybe not the same ring to Remember the Alamo in 1836, but this is a rallying cry in the Northwest in 1813. Remember the Raisin. Other fronts stall. The march to Canada makes its way where New York militia go towards Lake Erie, actually cross the Niagara River and make their way into Canada. They fail to win any progress at the Battle of Queenstown Heights. The Canadian forces repel the Americans. Winfield Scott is there. He's one of the soldiers who sees the regular army, the U.S. Army, small force crossing onto the Canadian side. The American commander literally begins to wave the militia over, and the New York militia basically get up to the border, the river, and say, whoops, we didn't sign up to fight in a foreign war. Militia only fight on American soil. And so the professional army there is getting slaughtered at Queenstown Heights, and the militia is kind of watching from the other side. Something of an embarrassment, but the same thing happens at the 3rd point of attack near Lake Champlain. New England and New York militia say, we didn't sign up to fight in a foreign war, and that completely stagnates any attempts to move on Montreal in 1812. The bright spot for the United States in 1812 is the Navy. 7 frigates survive. They're just one class of ships smaller than the ship of the line. Those are the British ships that have like 2 rows of guns. They have 80 cannon. The American cannon and the American ships are lighter, faster, and better equipped with modern guns, and they surprise the English. This is a painting of the U.S. Constitution. What's that? It is still, to this day, maybe not worldwide, but at least in the United States, the still oldest commissioned ship in the world. Meaning, technically, if we were to go to war, we could send the Constitution out and, have it quickly get destroyed by a modern Navy, probably by a ship-to-ship missile before anything got close enough to deal with anything. So it gets the nickname during this conflict of Old Ironsides. It's built from live oak, and the cannons from the British bounce off without exploding. And someone on the British crew, this is the French captured ship called the Guerrière or something, if I'm pronouncing correctly. It was originally a French ship taken by the English and fights the Constitution here. And one British crew member apparently says, look, her sides are made of iron. That wasn't the case, of course. But in 1812, the U.S. Navy defeats 7 British warships in ship-to-ship fighting. Now, this, of course, on the surface looks very impressive. The English press and the English people are utterly humiliated. They can't believe this happened. How did we lose? I mean, the British Navy doesn't lose to anybody. They're still high on the destruction of the French fleet at Trafalgar in 1805. Nelson's great victory where he dies literally at the very end of the battle. We lose only 3 small craft. And the truth beyond the perception of the American Navy fighting very well against the Great Britain is that most of our ships are stuck in port for the remainder of the war. The Constitution, in an epic escape, is looking at fighting 2 or 3 equivalent-sized British warships and send out rowboats because there's no breeze to pull the ship. Or there's another thing where you throw the anchor out into ahead of the ship, pull the anchor, and that pulls the ship along, and the Constitution is able to escape. So you pick and choose where you fight. But certainly it gives a lot of glory to those sailors who had first seen combat in the Barbary Pirate Wars, and of course in the Quasi-War as well. So the Navy really allows probably Madison to win very close re-election in 1812. Lest we forget that there is a presidential election just a couple months after the war starts. Let's go back to the notes here. The party was split in 1812. The Federalists essentially don't run their own candidate. What they do is they adopt the Republican running against Madison. So this whole divided party idea. DeWitt Clinton of New York, the Federalists say, okay, rather than run a candidate, we're not going to probably do any better. We'll just back him. The Federalists win back whole states in Congress in 1812. So said differently, and maybe to plagiarize from Mark Twain, rumors of the death of the Federalist Party are highly exaggerated and premature. That wasn't the case at all. For 1813, Madison pushes Congress to increase the size of the armed forces of the United States. They build 10 new ships, recruit 22,000 soldiers for the regular army, because militia ain't getting it done. Not at all. They fight sometimes okay, but usually they have to be there with, this is a lesson from the American Revolution, with regular soldiers. Usually what you found in the American Revolution is that you had the regular army, the longtime recruits there to shoot the militia if they run off the battlefield. That's what Daniel Morgan told Nathaniel Greene in the South, in the Carolinas. Put the militia in front with the regular soldiers behind them. If they run before they fire 2 or 3 times, shoot them. And they'll fear just as easily the British coming at them than the regular army soldiers. Imagine carrying that out. Finally, he also passes a bill to increase taxes, which you need to fight the war. The tax bill is an assessment on salt, land, stills, where you, of course, turn your different crops into alcohol, sugar, and carriages. The Secretary of Treasury really made this point clear to Madison. You have to find a way to get revenue. At one point, he tells the president there is literally enough money in the Treasury to run the war for 1 month. In which Madison's like, what? And, Congress didn't do anything prior to the war to raise some revenue for the war. The military plan for 1813 is simple. Get the British out of the Northwest and then negotiate an end to the conflict. How they go about doing that? Well, they're going to have to, for starters, put in some new, young, and ambitious talent. The war turns around in 1813. The U.S. could not get complete control of Lake Ontario, but they get control, which is right here, along the northern border of New York, but they do get control of Lake Erie. This is where you see Perry, 1813. This is a reference to Oliver Hazard Perry, possibly one of the coolest names in the War of 1812. He builds a fleet from scratch, a green navy, because the timbers of the trees are still green. Builds it right there on the eastern edge of Lake Erie and sails across it to take on an equivalent British fleet. Forces the British ships to surrender the Battle of Lake Erie and scribbles a note to William Henry Harrison, who is now the commander who had surrendered Detroit the year before, was all set to be hanged or in front of a firing squad for just turning it over without a shot being fired. Someone said, he did fight in the American Revolution, and then they basically pardoned the guy. Maybe he should have been shot. Anyway, now we've got Harrison in charge. Now, new, vigorous leadership. And the game changer for Harrison is that when he gets the note from Oliver Hazard Perry that he's won control, he's defeated the British fleet on Lake Erie, and it's one of the most famous lines from the War of 1812. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. You may have heard the kind of satirical version of that. We have met the enemy, and it is us. Sometimes people say that when they are making comments of culture or anything else. It's a reversal of 1812, in other words. So all the territory that had been lost is about to be gained back. Harrison chases British elements out of the Indiana Territory, and because of the Battle of Tippecanoe, which pushes completely Tecumseh and his allies towards the British, they fight in October of 1813 here on the Canadian side, what's called Upper Canada. This is the Battle of Thames, or the Battle of Thames River, the fall of 1813. He defeats a force of British and Indian allies. Tecumseh is killed at the battle by Kentucky Congressman Richard Johnson, who uses that as publicity for the rest of his political career. Who killed Tecumseh? This guy. I mean, literally, that's what he did for the remainder of his time. I think he became vice president later on at some point in his career. Another whatever vice president we don't really think much about. In the Southwest, Tecumseh, during his life, had inspired the Indians, including the Red Stick Creeks. So let's take a look at the territory we're referencing when it comes to the American Southwest. The war within the war within the war is the Creek War in 1813 and 1814. The Creek Indians were, like Tecumseh in the Northwest, resisting American encroachments into their territory, what is eastern and central Alabama. The United States had already annexed West Florida, so the writing they could see was on the wall. We had taken the Mobile district and all the way to the Perdido River, again, weakening Spanish control over West Florida. So within this large war is a smaller one where the inhabitants of the Southwest had to deal with that. In August of 1813, after American militia had attacked Creeks at the Burnt Creek battle, in retaliation, to no one's surprise, Creeks organized and overran this area right here. This is Fort Mims, which is about 40 miles north of Mobile. Several hundred free blacks, Americans, and Indians who had taken refuge near Fort Mims. It's on a guy named Mims. It's basically a crudely thrown together stockade and fort, were victims in this attack. And this awakens the sleeping giant of the Americans who live in the Southwest areas. White, black, friendly Indians, women. This is the Remember the Raisin of the Southwest Territory. Remember the Raisin referring to what happened in 1813 when surrendering Americans who were wounded were killed by allies, Indian allies of the British. Andrew Jackson, Major General of the Tennessee Militia, moved south towards the areas occupied by the Red Stick Indians with volunteers, which will be the beginning of what you associate, of course, the Tennessee as the volunteer state. I think a volunteer state tag is official with Tennessee in connection to the Mexico War a little bit later. With him, he had several individuals who would be instrumental in the future of the United States who were attached to the Tennessee militia. One of them is a 27-year-old David Crockett. He preferred David, everybody. And the 21-year-old Sam Houston. Later, both would go on to fame in Texas. He fights a series of inconclusive battles in the fall and winter of 1813 and 1814 and has constant disciplinary problems. This area here, now, if you're in, what's this, Atlanta about here, you drive through Interstate 20 and 59. This is the Talladega Forest. It is a thick, impassable forest. They built a racetrack there, I heard, for race cars. But yeah, you go right through that when you crisscross Alabama on your way into Mississippi. Muscle Shoals is up here, swamps. This is tough territory, and it gave the Creeks a lot of advantages. Jackson, however, has more problems with his own soldiers than with the Creek enemy. 2 times he turned his own guns on his own soldiers. He executes a deserter. As one historian said, you got to the point where Jackson's soldiers were more afraid of him than the Indians. So you might as well stick around and fight. What were they doing? These were volunteers who were recruited, and then they said, our time is up. Militia, what they often did was say, I signed up for 90 days. It's now 80 days. I need 10 days to get home. So I'm going to include that in the 90. It's not 90 days of service, then go home. It takes me 10 days to return to where I live. So I'm going to use that trip. And Jackson said, no, I don't think so. And they said, yes, we are. And he said, okay, let's have a military parade, everybody. And they're like, okay, fine, a parade. And they march out to the parade ground only to find out that he has cannons trained right on the soldiers. And he marches, in one case, I kid you not, this is where you know this guy is made of tough stuff. He's on his horse and he marches in between the cannons that are all trained on his soldiers and the militia who are all saying they're going to go home. He just rides back and forth. And they're like, General, sir, you're going to get shot when the cannons go off. He says, fire if I give the order. I mean, now the soldiers are like, okay, this guy is full, bat, what, crazy, and I'll just stick around. So he had to do that a couple of times during the Creek War campaign. He corners in this campaign, however, he meets with success right here at the beginning, I believe it was, of 1814 at a place called Horseshoe Bend. I do have a slide of it. This is the Tallapoosa River in eastern Alabama, not too far from the Georgia border. It's a national park. I've been here. Again, thick woods where about 1,000 creeks are holed up in the fall of 1813, beginning of 1814. He corners these 1,000 Red Stick Creek, and in the Battle of March 1814, 800 or so are killed. Many of them are killed when what they do is they form basically a line across here, and Jackson's forces attack this way, and they're basically stuck with their backs to the Tallapoosa River. And Jackson has other soldiers waiting on the other side, and then when they try to make their way to safety across the river, a lot of them drown, a lot of them are shot and killed. 800 casualties. Jackson fights at Horseshoe Bend with, on his side, Cherokee allies, along with Houston's wounded. Davy Crockett's there, I believe. Houston has one of several wounds he carries throughout this campaign. Jackson even later admits that the carnage was, as he called it, dreadful, dreadful. And the aftermath of the battle, the war within the war within the war, is very important for the United States. I mean, the Creeks sign away tens of thousands of acres. It's a game changer for what it means for the United States after the War of 1812 concludes. Okay. I went past 8:15, sorry.